The Iron Leviathan. The invention of the submarine ship. Chapter 2. Thunder on the Horizon. Episode 1. The War Worsens. The spring of 1862 arrived like a fist. What had begun as a bitter political rift had spiraled into something far darker. Across the torn belly of the United States, railroads screamed under the weight of cannon and coal, and smoke rose like funeral veils from towns gutted by battle. The Civil War had grown teeth, jagged, iron teeth, and it bit down on both North and South with equal cruelty. The papers in New York were full of fury. Lincoln's call for more men had bled every county. In Richmond, voices called for divine judgment against Union tyranny. But in the port cities, in Charleston, Wilmington, and Savannah, something else stirred, a whispered fear of what now waited beneath the waves. Out at sea, ships vanished. Not all at once, not in storms or fire, but quietly, unsettlingly. A Union coal barge sunk off the Carolinas with no cannon fire. A Confederate cruiser lost off the Florida Keys, its mast later found gnawed in half, covered in black slime. Coastal patrols spoke of unnatural currents, glowing wakes, and pressure that crushed hulls like eggshells. The Navy blamed Confederate sabotage. The Confederacy claimed it was all Northern lies. But the sailors knew better. Something was changing in the water. Episode 2. Admiral Caleb Thorne and the Ash-Gray Admiralty. Deep within the gnarled halls of Fort Sumter, its interior rebuilt with iron scavenged from old slavers, Admiral Caleb Thorne laid his map across a blackwood table and stabbed it with a brass compass. "Here," he said, tapping an abyss off the Georgia shelf. "This trench is older than any chart. The Spanish called it La Boca del Diablo, the Devil's Mouth." The room was filled with strange men. Confederate generals, yes, but also foreign mercenaries, exiled engineers, and a bald man with tattooed eyelids who said he could hear voices in water. Thorne had gathered them not for strategy, but for sorcery. He believed in Elias Finch. More precisely, he believed in the myth that Finch's invention had scratched the skin of something ancient. Thorne had intercepted fragments of Elias's blueprints, half-burned papers smuggled out of New Haven, stolen by the same spy who'd barely escaped Red Keegan's hammer. He studied the design like Holy Scripture, then rewrote it with blood and Southern steel. He commissioned vessels not meant for men, but for ghosts. He called them the Ash-Gray Admiralty. 8 prototype submersibles, powered by steam, coal, and a fluid he called whale blood, though no sailor ever confirmed its source. Each vessel bore a name from Nightmare, Night Hag, Widow's Lantern, Salt Eater, the Crying Bell. He gave them to outlaws and poets, to drowned captains and preachers who had once claimed to speak in tongues. Their orders: sail into the Devil's Mouth and find the place where Finch's monster had gone. They were not told to return. Episode 3. The Dreams of Margaret Finch. Back in New Haven, Margaret Finch woke to the sound of waves crashing against her window. But there were no waves. The night was still, the sea far off. She sat up, her old shawl clutched to her chest, breath fogging in the cold air. And there, just outside her window, stood Elias. Soaked, pale, barnacles on his sleeves. He did not speak. His mouth moved soundlessly, like he was beneath the ocean still. He placed one hand on the glass. When she blinked, he was gone. The next morning, she found salt streaks on the pane. That same day, a pair of fishermen dragging their nets through the lower harbor caught something that shouldn't have been there, a rusted, barnacle-covered hatch. Part of a larger vessel, torn in half. Inside was a small brass chamber sealed with wax. The Navy arrived within hours. They pried it open and found Elias's final journal. Not his sketches or mathematics, but his voice, recorded in looping cursive. "Greater than I no longer pilot her. She dreams now. She moves not on steam or pressure, but memory. Something sleeps in the deep. Not a beast, not a god, something older, and it listens." The pages were water-stained, but whole. They changed everything. Episode 4. Graves returns. Captain Nathaniel Graves had changed since New Haven. He no longer wore his coat buttoned or his hair clean. He looked as if he'd wrestled fate and hadn't quite won. But when he held Elias's journal in his hands, he didn't see madness. He saw a blueprint for victory. The Union needed something radical. Its navy was stalemated. Its ports were choked. And now, rumors of Confederate ghost ships haunted every admiral's desk. Graves gathered the remains of Finch's work and pitched the impossible. A second Leviathan. Faster, stronger, smarter. And not just to match the Confederate threat, but to command the ocean. He called it the Leviathan Directive. Congress laughed. Until Charleston exploded. Episode 5. Blood and Salt. It began as a mist. A Confederate convoy sailing past Tybee Island vanished in fog so thick the sun turned black. Union scouts on the cliffs heard no cannon fire. Only low groans, like whales in mourning. When they ventured down, they found wreckage, but no bodies. Just a tide line of blood, crusted like rust along the sand. The second night, a Union sloop burst into flame from beneath, its hull split by an unseen force. The third night, local fishermen found black fins circling the coast. Not sharks, not whales. Something new. They called them devil fish. Episode 6. Margaret's Resolve. The Leviathan journal arrived in a sealed chest, wrapped in oilcloth, bolted 3 times, and stamped with the Navy's seal, but it was not Graves who first opened it. It was Margaret. Alone in her brother's old workshop, the cradle, still half collapsed and choked with vines. She unscrewed the chest's brass locks with the same screwdriver Elias had used on his first model. Dust rose. Inside, layered in dried kelp and ink-stained pages, were the final traces of a man who had vanished into legend. She read every word. Some pages were engineering, others were near prophetic ramblings, visions of stars beneath the sea, clocks that beat in sync with tides, pressure patterns that mapped themselves into music. But one passage stuck out. Greater than, the machine is a womb. The war has made men desperate for monsters, but what they need are midwives. Vessels to birth a new way. One that listens instead of shouts. One that submerges to understand instead of surface to destroy. Margaret closed the book and wept. When she emerged from the workshop the next morning, her eyes were red, but her spine had stiffened into steel. "I'll finish it," she said. Graves, who had been waiting on the dock, blinked. "You'll finish what?" "Not a weapon," she replied, "but a voice. One that speaks for all the drowned and unheard. My brother built the first Leviathan to win peace. I'll build the second to declare it." Episode 7. Rebuilding the Cradle. The townsfolk had thought her mad. That Margaret Finch, the abolitionist firebrand, the recluse in mourning, had finally broken. But then they saw what she built. Over the next 6 weeks, the shipyard bloomed with sparks and hammers. The remaining members of Elias's crew, Jonas, Red, Peter, returned without needing to be asked. Even those who once whispered of demons came to help, guilt stirring in the gut. A new hull took shape. This one was narrower, longer, lined with lightweight steel forged in 3 cities. The propeller wasn't cranked manually, but powered by a hybrid combustion engine designed from Finch's own notes. Margaret did not mimic Elias. She improved him. Where he had drawn monsters, she carved miracles. She consulted with scientists from Boston, poets from Baltimore, and physicists from a hidden society in Philadelphia who claimed to read waveforms like sheet music. The new vessel would not merely dive. It would sing. Episode 8. The Devil Fish Rise. Meanwhile, the Confederate Ghost Fleet grew bold. Admiral Thorne's ash-gray admiralty had finished the trials in the Devil's Mouth, and now returned with trophies, Union ship wheels with no ships, sailors lost for weeks returned with gills carved into their necks, unable to speak but scribbling sea maps in salt. Each of Thorne's 8 submersibles was captained by someone who had either died or should have. One by a woman hung for piracy but returned to life in a swamp. One by a blind man who read sonar through the bones in his jaw. One by a preacher who refused to surface and delivered his sermons only through radio static. They did not coordinate in squadrons. They hunted. And with each ship they sank, they whispered through the water, an eerie harmonic frequency that rattled Union hulls and shattered glass portholes. Something ancient had heard them. Episode 9. The Navy breaks its silence. On June 5, 1862, under the highest security clearance available, Captain Graves presented the Leviathan directive to the Naval High Council in Washington, D.C. A dozen generals, admirals, and politicians sat at a long oaken table. Behind them hung flags too tired to flutter. Graves placed a single device on the table, a black metal sphere, humming faintly. "This," he said, "is not a bomb. It is a song, recorded at 800 feet below the Devil's Mouth. It matches no whale, no wave, no known machine." He let it play. At first, nothing. Then, a slow, warbling echo, like wind in a cathedral. Then pulses. Then a deep, resonant tone that made the windows tremble. One general dropped his pen. Graves continued, "This is not just a war of nations. It is now a war of depths. We must respond in kind." Silence followed. Then, finally, one admiral spoke. "What do you need?" Graves smiled. "Time, and Margaret Finch." Episode 10. The Second Iron Leviathan. They called it Leviathan Reborn. 55 feet from bow to stern. Pressure resistant to 1,000 feet. Lined with vibranium-tempered alloys. An experimental fusion of ore and salt derived from Finch's forgotten experiments. Unlike the first, it had sonar. Not merely for detection, but for communication. It could map the seabed in living color, and translate harmonic frequencies into readable language. Its torpedoes were non-lethal, sound bursts calibrated to disable propellers and disorient human senses. It had no guns. It had a library. Margaret sat in the pilot's chair 2 days before launch, staring at the main controls. She didn't smile. Instead, she whispered what her brother had once whispered to the sea. "If you remember him, remember me." Episode 11. Descent. The day of the launch arrived quiet. The ocean held its breath. The dock at New Haven was barren, save for Graves, Red, Peter, and Jonas. Margaret stood beside the vessel, clad not in navy blue but in a black coat that had once belonged to Elias. Her hair was pinned back. Her eyes were hard steel. The second Iron Leviathan, sleek, metallic, and sinuous like a great eel, shimmered in the morning sun. Its hull bore no emblem, no flag, only a single engraving near the conning tower. "To speak peace to the deep." No newspapers covered the event. No crowds waved. It was not a ship for celebration. It was a ship for reckoning. The crew entered without words. Margaret sealed the hatch herself. Graves watched as the last bolt was turned. Then, with a rumble like thunder turned inward, the Leviathan slid into the harbor and disappeared beneath the surface without a splash. Episode 12. Into the Abyss. The descent was smooth. The vessel hummed like a sleeping beast. Inside, the walls pulsed gently with blue bioluminescence, an effect designed by Peter to reduce claustrophobia. They passed 100 feet. Outside, the world turned black. Jonas adjusted the sonar, its pulses clicking like crickets. Red manned the engine coils. Margaret stood at the central console, one hand on a lever, the other on a microphone. They listened. At 750 feet, the sonar caught something. A movement. Not a fish, not a current. But vibration, a rhythmic, deliberate motion, circling. "Contact," Jonas said, his voice a whisper. They drifted forward, lights dimmed. Ahead, something pulsed. A Confederate vessel, not just any. The crying bell, one of Thorne's ghost fleet. It hovered like a shadow in the dark, hull covered in barnacles and bones. Its captain, they later learned, was a former surgeon who removed his own eyes to see better in dreams. The Confederate vessel did not fire. Neither did Margaret. Instead, she activated the Leviathan's harmonic projector. The first sound emitted was not a threat. It was a greeting. 3 tones, spaced evenly. A note of peace. The Confederate vessel twitched. Lights flickered. Something, someone, responded with static. Then, the entire sea floor shifted. Episode 13. The Devil's Mouth Opens. From the trench below, La Boca del Diablo, something rose. Not a vessel, not a beast. A shape. Massive, circular, covered in coral and rusted anchors. As it breached the edge of visibility, the sonar erupted in panic. Lines of unreadable symbols splashed across the screen. Jonas recoiled. Red muttered a prayer. Margaret stepped forward. "It's not an enemy," she said. "How do you know?" Peter asked, pale. "Because it doesn't move. It listens." The Leviathan hovered inches above the trench. The Confederate vessel drifted beside it like a curious sibling. For one suspended moment, war paused. And then came the voice. Not in English, not in any tongue. A pressure, a rhythm, felt in bones, blood, and breath. Margaret knelt by the console and, without understanding why, matched the rhythm with her fingers. Morse, Elias's old system. She tapped back. And the trench answered. Episode 14. Peace beneath the surface. The next 12 hours were unrecorded. What happened between the two vessels, between the humans and the ancient force beneath, would become the center of 1,000 conflicting stories. Some said the trench revealed a city made of shipwrecks. Others claimed the ocean spoke truths no man could survive. Only Margaret knew for sure, and she never spoke of it. But when the Leviathan surfaced again at dawn, the Confederate vessel rose beside it, sails lowered. There were no prisoners, no dead. Only silence. Margaret sent a single radio transmission. "The sea has remembered. The war does not belong here." Then she disappeared again. Episode 15. The Tide Turns. Days later, Admiral Thorne's ghost fleet vanished from every radar and map. Confederate ports reported vessels returning, but stripped of weapons and crew unwilling to speak. The ash-gray Admiralty disbanded. And in New Haven, a box washed ashore. Inside, Elias Finch's first compass, perfectly preserved, pointing not north, but down. Chapter 2 ends. The Iron Leviathan had become more than a machine. It had become a myth. And the sea, once a graveyard, now stirred with something new. Hope.